The new owners had only been in the house for a week when the first oddities began. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where everyone knew each other's schedules, and nothing unusual ever happened, or at least, that's what they thought. But on the first Sunday morning, when the house should have been filled with sunlight, a subtle chill lingered in the hallway, brushing the skin of anyone who walked through. Neighbors described Phil Silver's old home as always a bit off, even when he lived there. One mentioned how he loved practical jokes and could make an empty room feel like it was laughing. Others said they sometimes saw shadows moving behind curtains late at night, even though the house was dark and supposedly empty. The new owners had laughed it off until their own experiences began. Started small. Doors, which they were sure they'd closed, would be slightly ajar. Lights in the kitchen flickered when no one was nearby. A vintage record player in the corner, untouched for decades, occasionally sputtered with static, as if someone had pressed play and then vanished. The couple tried to rationalize each occurrence. Faulty wiring, uneven floors, creaking wood, but the frequency of events made them uneasy. One evening, after reading about local hauntings, they decided to conduct simple tests. They placed small cameras around the house, recorded the temperature in rooms at different times, and even kept a notebook of every sound, light flicker, and door movement. They avoided sensationalism, documenting everything calmly. The most compelling evidence came from the basement. It was dark, cold, and smelled faintly of old cedar and dust. On 2 separate nights, their thermal camera picked up cold spots forming in the shape of a person, one near the stairway, another near the old storage shelves, before disappearing moments later. The camera didn't catch a physical body, and the readings suggested no drafts or leaks could account for the drops in temperature. Neighbors provided context that made the situation almost tangible. An elderly man recalled how, during Phil Silver's later years, he would often disappear into the basement, muttering lines from scripts under his breath. He was always rehearsing, the neighbor said, but sometimes it felt like he wasn't alone down there. Even more strange, the couple noticed patterns in the timing of events. Most anomalies happened late at night, around the hours Phil Silvers had been known to stay up practicing routines, and most often near objects he had treasured. His old trophy case, a piano in the living room, a desk cluttered with notes. Nothing violent occurred. Nothing threatening, just subtle, unmistakable signs that someone or something was still moving in the house in his absence. By the end of the first month, the couple accepted the possibility that the house retained more than just memories. They never felt endangered, but there was a persistent awareness, a sense of being observed not by strangers, but by someone who had lived, laughed, and worked there for decades. Even with modern cameras, notes, and logical explanations, the evidence was stubbornly consistent. Phil Silver's presence lingered, a subtle imprint that didn't need to terrify to be undeniably real. The story of the Silvers' house doesn't end with shadows or screams, but with a quiet, almost affectionate tension. It's the kind of haunting that stays in the corners of your vision, in the creaks of old floorboards, in the inexplicable chill by the piano at night. Real, understated, and impossible to fully explain, but perhaps, for Phil Silvers, that was exactly the kind of audience he wanted. Even after a few weeks, the new owners found themselves adjusting to an unspoken rhythm in the house, as though it had a schedule of its own. The mornings were bright, almost cheerful, with sunlight spilling through the tall, slightly warped windows, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. But evenings were different. They carried a weight, a subtle heaviness that seemed to settle into the corners of rooms. The couple learned to notice small patterns. The way the light in the hallway would dim unnaturally at precisely 7:43 p.m., or how the faint scent of cigar smoke, though no one in the house smoked, would hang near the fireplace for a few moments before vanishing entirely. One Saturday, the husband, a practical man by nature, decided to trace the origin of the cold spots that had appeared in the basement. He brought a digital thermometer, a laser measure, and a notebook, documenting every detail meticulously. The basement was long and narrow, lined with old shelving that carried remnants of Phil Silver's life, stacks of worn scripts, yellowed photographs, trophies, and an assortment of unmarked boxes. As he walked the length of the room, the thermometer's readings fluctuated subtly, dipping in some areas by almost 10 degrees in seconds, only to normalize again moments later. He chalked it up to drafts at first, but when he closed the basement door and sealed all the vents, the cold spots persisted. Meanwhile, the wife had begun noticing something else, a pattern of auditory echoes. At first, it was just the faintest murmuring, soft and almost indiscernible, as if someone were rehearsing lines from memory in another room. She would stop and listen, heart quickening, only to realize that the sound came from no discernible source. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, but it was unmistakably human. One evening, she followed it into the living room, where the piano sat near the window. The keys had not been touched, yet a single note lingered in the air, vibrating faintly, like a memory struggling to hold shape. Determined to understand, they brought in a local historian, a man familiar with Hollywood history and old estates. He examined the house with careful eyes, noting the way the wood had settled over decades, the imperfections in the walls, and the acoustics that might carry ordinary sounds in strange ways. But even he paused, notebook in hand, when a faint, deliberate tapping came from the upstairs hallway. "I've been in houses hundreds of times this old," he said quietly. "But that sound, it's almost too rhythmic, too intentional to be random." By the third week, the neighbors began sharing their own stories more freely. An elderly woman, Mrs. Carmichael, recalled seeing lights flicker in the living room late at night long before the new owners moved in. "He liked to practice," she said, shaking her head. "And sometimes it felt like the walls themselves were listening. You could hear laughter echo down the street, but nobody was outside." Another neighbor remembered visiting Phil Silvers years ago and being startled by the basement's strange atmosphere. The smell of cigars, the quiet hum of old machinery, and the faint click of typewriter keys, though the machine was unplugged. The couple began keeping a more detailed log, documenting every incident. The flickering lights, cold drafts, creaking floors, and faint sounds. On one night in particular, the husband sat at the desk in the study, reviewing old photographs of Silver's television sets, scripts, and personal letters. The room was silent, the shadows long, stretching toward the corners as the moonlight filtered through the blinds. Then, a photograph on the wall, a candid shot of Phil laughing on the set of Sergeant Bilko, tilted forward slightly, as though nudged by an invisible hand. He froze, staring at it, heart pounding. He could hear a faint rustle from the corner of the room, a quiet presence that wasn't threatening, but impossible to ignore. Over time, they realized that the house demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement of its history. It wasn't menacing, but it was insistent. Everyday objects seemed to respond to their movements. A script might slide slightly on a shelf, a chair would shift just enough to be noticed, or a record would skip the same section repeatedly, even when rewound. The couple tried to interact calmly, talking softly to the empty rooms, acknowledging the presence they could not see. Some nights, when the house was entirely still, they would sit together in the living room, listening to the faint hum of electricity, the soft groan of the settling wood, and the occasional, inexplicable echo of laughter. It was subtle, quiet, and deeply human. The house did not scream. It did not rage, it simply existed, layered with memory. And Phil Silver's presence lingered like a shadow cast long after the light had faded. And yet, despite all the careful documentation, all the logical precautions, they could not explain everything. Every new observation carried the same undertone, that someone who had lived and loved and laughed in this house had left a piece of himself behind, stubborn, lingering, and quietly insistent. They began to feel that the house had its own consciousness, one shaped by decades of life, performance, and personality. And each night, as the clock ticked closer to the hour Phil Silvers had once retired to bed, the house seemed to stir ever so slightly, waiting, listening, remembering. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The following week, the atmosphere in the house seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows during the day, but it did little to dispel the peculiar sensations that settled in the evening. The couple noticed it first in the kitchen. The faint smell of fresh coffee, strong, rich, almost too precise, hovering near the countertop, though no coffee maker had been turned on. The aroma was oddly comforting, and yet, It carried an unshakable sense of being observed. Late one night, the husband wandered into the living room, drawn by a soft, repetitive tapping coming from the piano. The keys themselves were untouched, yet each tap resonated with deliberate rhythm, faint but unmistakable. Kneeling on the floor, he traced the pattern, realizing that it wasn't random. It followed the cadence of a classic Bilko line, the kind of comedic timing Phil Silvers had perfected decades ago. Goosebumps prickled his skin. He had studied film and television history, and he recognized it immediately, a rhythm that no casual draft or structural settling could produce. Meanwhile, the wife began noticing subtle shifts in the arrangement of items around the house. A stack of scripts she had left neatly on the coffee table would appear in a different order the next morning. A small, brass trophy on the shelf once facing forward would tilt slightly to the left, no matter how carefully it was positioned. She tried to rationalize, blaming it on uneven floors or vibrations from passing cars. Yet the consistency and the timing of the changes defied explanation. Often, the movements occurred in sync with moments when the couple was talking about Phil Silver's life, his routines, or a specific scene from Sergeant Bilko. One afternoon, the couple decided to perform a simple test. They set up a series of motion-sensitive cameras in the living room, basement, and study, leaving them to record overnight. When reviewing the footage the next morning, they saw nothing unusual. No human figures, no intruders, but the recordings revealed inexplicable anomalies. A door handle slowly rotated as though someone had gently grasped it. Shadows shifted along the walls with no source. A small piece of paper, a note from one of Phil Silver's scripts, fluttered and slid across the desk as though nudged by an unseen hand. Every incident was brief, subtle, almost polite, never violent, never aggressive, but consistent enough to suggest an intelligent presence. Neighbors began to offer more insight, recounting memories from decades earlier. One former colleague of Silver's, now elderly, remembered visiting the house for a small gathering and feeling that the house itself had a personality. "It wasn't just him," the neighbor said, voice soft, distant. "The walls, the floors, they listened. They responded. Even when he wasn't in the room, you could feel him there. It was like stepping into a living stage." Another neighbor recalled seeing the windows flicker with light at odd hours, despite the house being dark inside. They had assumed it was Phil practicing lines in front of mirrors late at night, but no reflection could fully explain the patterns of movement. In the evenings, the couple began to notice the rhythm of the house. It was as if time itself slowed in certain rooms, the study, especially. The clock on the wall would tick in uneven increments, 1 second stretched, another compressed, though the mechanism was perfect. Papers, notes, and photographs seemed to respond to their attention. A page from an old script might lift slightly when read aloud, settling again as if acknowledging comprehension. Even the air felt heavier in some corners, carrying faint traces of cigar smoke, ink, and cedar, the lingering scent of Silver's life. One particularly quiet night, the wife found herself drawn to the basement once more. The stairway was dimly lit, the steps creaking softly underfoot. The temperature dropped noticeably as she descended, colder than any draft should allow. A single bulb flickered, casting long, uneven shadows across the shelving lined with scripts, photographs, and trophies. She stood perfectly still, listening to the subtle hum of the house, the soft creak of the pipes, the faint thump of settling wood, and then, unmistakably, a low, almost playful chuckle echoing from somewhere behind the shelves. Her heart raced, yet there was no fear, only awe. It was a presence that was there, undeniably attentive, waiting to be noticed. When she returned upstairs, she found the husband in the living room, staring at the piano. The keys had shifted slightly, forming a pattern that matched the faint laugh she had just heard. It was almost as if they were communicating, leaving breadcrumbs of their awareness for the living to interpret. The house had its own voice, subtle and insistent, shaping moments of memory and performance into the present, refusing to be ignored. As the days passed, both of them became attuned to these cues, learning to navigate the house's quiet personality. Each room offered its own rhythm. The study responded to attention, the piano to curiosity, the basement to lingering reflection. The house was not haunted in the conventional sense. There were no shadows that leapt or walls that screamed. Instead, it breathed with the echoes of a life once lived fully, leaving gentle, unmistakable traces for those who dared to notice. And the couple, despite every logical explanation, could not deny it. Phil Silver's presence had left an indelible mark, subtle yet unyielding, woven into the very fabric of the house. By the time the couple had lived in the house for 2 months, a strange familiarity had settled over their daily routines. They moved through the rooms not just as occupants, but as careful participants in a dialogue with the house itself. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow, every faint, almost imperceptible sound became part of an ongoing conversation. The presence that lingered wasn't menacing, it was attentive, intimate, almost theatrical, like a performer observing an audience, long after the curtain had fallen. One rainy evening, the couple sat in the living room, the windows streaked with water, streetlights reflecting dimly through the mist. The old piano near the corner had been silent for hours, yet it seemed to vibrate faintly in rhythm with the rain tapping on the panes. They noticed that the brass lamp on the desk, usually stationary, had rotated slightly, casting light across a photograph of Phil Silvers in character. The glow illuminated the detail in his eyes, the mischievous arch of his brow, and for a moment, it was impossible not to feel that he was watching them, approving their careful observation of his home. The wife opened a drawer in the study and found an old notebook, yellowed with age. Inside were scribbles in Phil's handwriting. Reminders, joke ideas, lines from sketches he never performed, even notes about neighbors and small observations about the world around him. She traced her fingers over the faded ink and felt an uncanny connection, as though she was brushing against the very mind that had once lived in this space. It wasn't supernatural in a terrifying way, it was human, profoundly human, and it carried the weight of decades of creativity and life. In the basement, the husband found himself returning nightly. The air was cooler than the rest of the house, carrying faint scents of cedar, dust, and something he couldn't name, a subtle tang of old leather or polished wood. Each night, the same chill would crawl along the back of his neck as he moved past the shelves lined with memorabilia, the faint echo of footsteps soft, deliberate matching his own. Once, a box of scripts slid a few inches across the floor as he reached for it, as if nudged by invisible fingers. He stopped, heart racing, but the sound wasn't frightening. It was a reminder, a gentle mark left by someone who had been there long before him. Even their neighbors began to remark on the change in the house. "It's like it's alive," one said quietly as they watered the garden. "Not in a scary way, just aware. You can feel him there. It's like he's still performing, but differently now just for the people who notice." Another added that she sometimes glimpsed lights moving behind curtains at night, faint, rhythmic, as if someone were pacing, rehearsing lines no one else would ever hear. Over time, the couple came to understand that the house demanded respect, attention, and presence. They no longer rushed through it, no longer dismissed its subtleties. The door that occasionally opened on its own, the flickering lights, the soft laughter, they had become part of a quiet choreography. And in those moments, when the house settled around them like a living, breathing organism, they realized the haunting wasn't about fear. It was about memory, persistence, and the unmistakable echo of a life fully lived. One night, as a storm raged outside, they sat together in the living room. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, and the piano hummed faintly, as though resonating with the rhythm of the rain. In the soft glow of the lamp, the photograph of Phil Silvers seemed almost to animate. For the first time, they spoke aloud, sharing observations, recounting patterns, laughing quietly at the subtle jokes left behind in scripts, trophies, and tiny movements. And as the night deepened, a single note, pure, precise, deliberate, sounded from the piano. They froze, listening. It wasn't fear that held them still, but recognition. Someone or something was still here, still present, still participating in the quiet life of the house. The house remained alive in its own way, every creak, shadow, and whisper a testament to the man who had once walked its halls. The haunting wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, constant, and undeniably real. A living memory etched into wood, stone, and air. And though Phil Silvers was gone, the essence of his presence lingered, shaping the moments, the light, the sounds, and the very rhythm of life within these walls. It was a haunting that could be felt, understood, and respected, a presence that reminded the living that life, laughter, and memory do not vanish, even when a person does. And so, the couple lived on, not afraid but aware, attuned to the house's quiet choreography, learning that the true haunting was not in the shadows, but in the way a life could linger, subtly, persistently, beautifully, long after its owner had gone.